What do you get when someone gets their Bachelor of Science at MIT, their PhD at the University of Texas, and then they get their postdoc at Berkeley? You know, all those really, really slouchy schools. In today's episode, Dr. Daniel Goldman joins me. He's a physicist in training, those are his words, and he's one of the most imaginative scientists working at the intersection of physics, biology, and robotics today. And that's everybody else's words. And trust me, when I say this is a fascinating one today, that's a fascinating one. Now, have you ever heard of a sandfish? If you haven't, search out a video of them. Freaking crazy fascinating. Dan launched his career into spotlight studying them. They've got this ability when a predator comes after them to actually dive in the sand and literally swim away. Now, nobody understood how they did that, and Dan essentially filmed them using X-ray imaging and found they tuck their legs and swim through the sand. His study of sandfish, sidewinder snakes, sea turtles, fire ants, centipedes, and so much more are showing us how animals move in all sorts of terrains. Now, he's called the term robophysics, making robot versions of animals to test physical principles. In today's worlds of robotics, his possibilities are endless. Now, I always tell people when something looks simple, it's actually really hard. And studying the movements of animals to learn how they move a robot, well, you get where I'm going. Trust me, like Dan's story of the centipede, this episode, it's got lots of legs.
For real, 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 for real. Got a bunch of furry friends and I love them all the same. I'm an animal lover, veterinarian is the name. Let's share some pet stories from heartwarming to strange, losses and gains, from wacky to insane. For real. You're now tuned in to For Real with your host, Mark Kyle.
My guest is Dr. Dan Goldman, and we're going to talk about things you probably never really thought about: physics, robots, and animals. It's going to be a good one. Dan, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Mark, for having me.
Well, for you guys that are listening, we tried to do this a while ago, and Austin had a huge storm, and we kind of lost everything. So Dan is having patience with me and the weather here in Austin. Dan, I want to get into this. We started this before. We're going to have to start all over again. I want to talk about your journey.
Yeah.
You know, from wherever you want to start, how you got involved, what you're doing, and just hear your story.
Yeah, I can go all the way back to when I was a kid. I grew up somehow loving lizards and snakes, mainly lizards, and declared myself to be a herpetologist, anyone who would listen. And, that persisted, I think, until about, middle school. And then somebody showed me a book on special relativity, Einstein's little book on special relativity. And I said, wow, that's what a real scientist does, and I got to do that. And so I didn't understand anything, but I did know that there was.
How old were you?
I was probably middle school, 12, 13, But I thought it was cool, and I knew that math was somehow involved, so I decided I needed to learn a lot of math. This is me sort of trying to remember when I can probably not remember. And I did a lot of math in high school, and then when I was going to college, I had heard about this place, MIT, which I think, back then there was no internet. I think I had heard it from some silly TV show. But I got in and I went off to MIT and I studied physics and got excited about a certain type of physics, which I had read about in high school, actually, called nonlinear dynamics. Chaos, which was a thing in the late 80s and 90s, and then got really famous with Jurassic Park, where Jeff Goldblum's character talks about chaos.
Sure.
And I said, man, that's the kind of physics I want to do. It was a little weirder than the kind of standard particle physics or condensed matter physics, but it turned out there was one of the top places in the world for doing that was UT Austin. And so I came down to UT in 1994 and began my PhD with a very eminent physicist named Harry Sweeney, and stuck around Austin till about 2002, and had a blast doing the physics of sand, which sounds crazy for physicists to do, but there's really interesting problems associated with how piles of sand go from fluid-like to solid-like states to gaseous states, and had a lot of fun working on these kind of problems. I would say that I veered much more towards experimental physics. In physics, we kind of speciated into two types about 100 years ago: those who do theoretical physics, like Mr. Einstein, and those who like working on and building laboratory experiments. And I found at MIT that that's what I really like to do, doing some undergraduate research. And then at UT, I did my PhD in experimental physics and nonlinear dynamics. And that was my journey in physics. As I was getting towards the end of my PhD, I noticed that folks in this kind of area of physics were graduate student friends and colleagues of mine were getting interested in problems in biological physics or biophysics. And I had always been interested, as I had said, in the living world. And so I said, oh, that seems like something that might be interesting to me if I want to pursue this academic journey. And I said, well, I don't know if I want to work on molecules or cells, but I wonder if I could do biological physics of critters, of organisms. And nobody I knew was doing that. Nobody really had done much of that in physics. But I happened to chance upon a guy at UC Berkeley who was a world-renowned expert in organismal biomechanics, mainly locomotion, and had gotten very famous for his studies of cockroach locomotion, how cockroaches can run really fast and remain stable in the face of perturbation and can squeeze into gaps and crevices. A guy named Bob Full. And I wrote him and he said, okay, come on out for a postdoc. So I went out for a postdoc, and that's where I kind of learned that I actually could integrate my nonlinear dynamics, dynamical systems background, and organismal locomotion studies. And that's what has sort of propelled me to this day.
Well, I'm thinking about this. So you go from East Coast to Texas to the West Coast. You went all across the U.S., which is kind of cool too.
Yeah. That was a lot of fun. I like to travel, and I like meeting different folks from different areas and countries, and you know, I was really going where my passion led me, I should say.
Sure.
And it just with the added benefit, I got to live in some cool cities.
Well, the scary thing for me is you really didn't have a very good education. Those are horrible schools, all those.
No, it was a real schlepper, as we say.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I got, more importantly, and I tell this, it was advice I was given as a kid by actually a Nobel Prize winner. I just happened to go to his lecture and then was introduced. A guy named Max Perutz, who happened to be a famous biologist for his studies of hemoglobin. And he said, find a good mentor. And I was, high school kid. I didn't know what that meant, but boy, did I find great mentors, not only at MIT as an undergrad, a guy named John King, but also at UT Austin, a guy named Harry Sweeney, who's my PhD supervisor, and then again, Bob Full out at Berkeley. And so as much as the places are the quality of mentors whom I was able to meet and work with and learn from.
So you're started off, you're talking about sand, and this is going to go, which direction I'm going. So tell me about the sandfish. First off, one of the reasons when I started researching you is that sandfish thing. It's a cool, if you have never seen a video of a sandfish, you need to watch it if you're listening now. But how did you get there? And let's really dig into what you were doing with them.
Yeah. Well, that's a funny story as well, or funny to me, in that I was doing my postdoc, and what I realized, Bob Full helped me realize, is that my interest in sand, let's say, and really sand was a kind of just an interesting system to study from a physics perspective, because you could sort of see interesting transitions in material behavior just on your desktop.
Right.
It doesn't sound like anything exciting, but take a cup of sand. It's a solid. You can wiggle it around and it remains rigid. You tilt it enough, you pour it, it becomes a fluid. It pours down. And in fact, it not only becomes a fluid, it becomes a crazy high Mach number fluid. So the physics of actually sand flowing past your finger is not so different than that of a supersonic fluid flow of any other gas. Then it hits the ground and it dissipates all its energy because collisions are dissipative, and it forms a solid again. And so that's a pretty interesting set of transitions.
Sure.
Now, it just so happens when I was out of Berkeley, working with Bob, we realized that, boy, there's a whole lot of animals out there, like a sandfish, like you mentioned, but lizards, snakes, and even more broadly, any organism that interacts with a soil, where every time a foot or a body segment is interacting, you have the potential for the system to be starting in a solid state, go into a fluid-like state as the foot or body element enters, and then resolidifying potentially. So we realized that basic physics was absolutely critical to understand if you want to understand how any of these crazy desert animals do what they do. And so I learned that. And I just happened to be talking to Bob Full one day, and he said, boy, I was just at this demo day at Berkeley, and this guy, Berkeley had a very famous museum of comparative zoology, MC vertebrates, or whatever it's called. And there were world-renowned experts who studied animals from all over the world. There was a guy named Ted Pappenfuss, whose name I remember. He was a very famous herpetologist. And he had a sandfish lizard. And Bob had seen the sandfish lizard. Said, man, that thing goes into the soil and you can't see where it is. So Ted let me borrow a lizard he had and his own pet. And I filmed it. I still have that video. I said, man, that's amazing. What on earth is it doing under there? Nobody knew. And so then I remember that I said, okay, I want to get a little preliminary data. I'd gotten a job. I was looking for faculty jobs, and I landed a job at Georgia Tech, which was a place which had a strong history of nonlinear science. So someone like me could be brought into a physics department, but also was looking to grow in biological physics. And I said, well, this could be biological physics if you trust me that it, maybe one day. And so Georgia Tech did. And as I was getting ready to move out, I said, I need some preliminary data because I want to do this sandfish. I want to see what on earth is going on with these sandfish. So I happened to get some sandfish. You could sent away for some. I can't remember where. But more importantly, perhaps, I happened to find some folks with x-rays, maybe in the East Bay. I can't remember it now. And I somehow went out and they let me throw a lizard in a bucket of sand in their x-ray machine. And we saw that this thing started to do, which later we understood to be a kind of wave on its body. And I had that video, and I took that lizard and brought it to Atlanta. And that's what got us started once I bought enough x-ray machines that I could actually see what was going on underneath the sand. So that was my sort of entry into sandfish. And it turned out to be a wonderful system to study and discover principles of effective interaction of a wiggly body with this weird material. And x-rays were our main tool by which we could see what was going on underneath the sand.
So you're looking at efficiency and how they, because the thing that I read, again, when I was doing my homework, is that they can basically disappear under the sand in less than half of a second.
Correct.
Which is crazy. And then they're able to basically swim through the sand, underneath the sand. So you're losing, I guess there's something, I'm going to hold this towards the end because I'm curious about this, is that, so you're looking at efficiency of how they work and how they're able to basically move. By the way, I'm trying to talk like a physicist. This is the craziest thing ever. Yeah. So I'm guessing in my very simple mind in this, you're learning how they're efficient and how they're able to glide through the sand. Basically, right?
Correct. Really, it's even less about efficiency. Efficiency is one measure, how much energy you use, let's say, to go a certain distance. And really, at some basic levels, how it works. You and I know how a car rolls pretty well, right? You roll the wheel.
Right.
And there's and in a no-slip wheel, your speed of your vehicle or your wheel will be directly proportional to how fast that wheel's rotating.
Right.
If I give you a similar prescription, say, okay, I'm going to bend my body, wiggle my foot, do whatever, and move over sand. Can you tell me how fast you'll go? And the answer had been no. So the first thing to do was actually, because I'm an experimental physicist, figure out what on earth is going on underneath there. So we developed a system where we could basically bring the environment into the laboratory. What I mean by that is that it turns out that sand, granular material, if it's just a bunch of dry sand, exists in different states in the natural world.
Sure.
So you might have windblown stuff, which is sort of pretty loose, and then over time it can get pretty compacted down. And it turns out that the force you have to apply to move through that can be quite different. It can be factors of 2 or 3 in regular sand. And so we wanted to be able to capture that variation in the laboratory. We also wanted to figure out how animals moved up sandy slopes. So we built something called fluidized beds, which are devices used in all sorts of industries, most, I'd say, prominently in catalytic cracking in oil and gas. In fact, I had worked on fluidized beds when I was a PhD student with Ari Swinney. And it's quite simple in principle. You have a container, bucket of sand with a porous bottom, porous such that the sand can't fall through the pores, but any gas can. And you pump air up uniformly through the base of that thing, big aquarium size thing, and above a critical airflow rate, the sand turns into kind of a fluid. It dances around,
Right.
and they turn off the airflow, and any imprint in the sand is gone. So if you do an experiment, you turn on the fluidized bed, turn it off, it's the system has forgotten about that experiment you did. Any tracks that might be laid down. So we developed fluidized beds. We got basically old X-ray machines, fluoro X-ray machines of the kind you might used to see in cardiac catheterization or even dental systems, and got some fancy high-speed, very sensitive cameras, and strapped them to the output phosphor of that X-ray machine, and give the animal a little nudge, wearing lead-lined capes and vests. Early of my students, Ryan Mallet, did all these experiments. And lo and behold, the animal indeed dove into the sand a half a second. When it was on the surface, you can't see, since this is audio, me gesticulating here, but it walked just like any other lizard with a so-called diagonal gait.
Right.
And then started wiggling its body. High-speed video revealed this, wiggling its body in a particular pattern, characteristic pattern. And when it was underneath the sand, it tucked its limbs to its body and basically used its body bending with a traveling wave of body bending from head to tail to propel itself into the material. And that's what we discovered.
It's and it's so, I find this stuff fascinating because kind of from there, did you transition to the Sidewinder rattlesnake?
Yeah, I mean, from there, once we started discovering that the first thing is, one, we could characterize these systems, and two, we could start to develop physics models. And those models we could talk about. As a preamble, I'll say that a lot of the models we now use, and had this idea very early on, are what look like robots. We call them robophysical models, and that leads to my other now kind of recent life.
Yeah.
But in addition to the kind of careful biomechanics studies we had done, to try, as you say, well, what makes a lizard move the fastest under sand? If it wiggles its body with a certain amplitude, or if it uses its legs. And so it's hard to answer those questions with you can make an observation. It's hard to answer those questions with the animal. But if you make a model, mathematical model, computer model, robot model, you could start to at least develop hypotheses. So once we got the bug that and the interest that we could study these systems, we started looking for other animals. And a colleague of mine that lived naturally in sand and that we could try to make some progress on, and a colleague of mine, a guy named Joe Mendelson, who had just shown up at Zoo Atlanta to be the director of research, right? Director of research. I happened to meet a friend of mine, David Hu, who's a very well-known biomechanics professor, mechanical engineering at Georgia Tech, and I were interested to collaborate with the zoo. We happened to meet Joe. Joe said, there's all these crazy animals out there, including nobody knows what the heck or how a sidewinder rattlesnake that does what it does in the deserts. And he says, I'm going out to the Yuma, the desert Southwest. You want to come and check things out? So I came with a student of mine, and Joe collected some sidewinders and brought them back to Zoo Atlanta, is my recollection. We also, by the way, he also showed this really cool little snake called a shovel-nosed snake, which also swims in sand for some distance. There's a handful of species out there, 10, 20 species, which a biologist named Mosauer in the 1930s classified as subarachnaceous, meaning they swim for distance under sand, not just bury themselves. This little snake, which you should look up, a shovel-nosed snake, gorgeous little long, skinny snake. We x-rayed them and found that they swim too in a different way than the sandfish. But, those are the subsurface. And we said, boy, if nobody really knows how these sidewinders work, we gotta attack this. So Joe got a bunch of sidewinders back at Zoo Atlanta. We, with some students and from postdocs, and built a big fluidized bed that was housed in kind of like one of those Home Depot 10-foot sheds out of the back of Zoo Atlanta in a place where nobody went. Put the big fluidized bed in there, made it so it could tilt up to 30 degrees, and then spent summers, poking sidewinders and studying how they ascended the sandy slopes.
And so what you guys discovered is that the steeper it is, as I read it, they put more pressure on the sand. Is that kind of in the simplest form?
Yeah, sort of. They what they do, it's actually a really interesting story. We did lots of our same, rinse and repeat. High-speed cameras, careful biomechanics study, tracking markers. Well, I don't think we were able to mark these animals, but doing the best we can to click points from the videos in a computer to track the so-called kinematics, how they're changing their body. And we noticed that when over flat sand, they were quite capable of moving. And as the sand slope increased in tilt, they also remained quite capable. In contrast to basically every other snake at Zoo Atlanta, which Joe and a former postdoc named Henry Astley basically threw into the bed and looked to see who could. And there's videos on our website who could move, who couldn't. And for the most part, most snakes were incompetent moving on sand, which was pretty funny. But sidewinders were just sort of like magic. Whoop, go up a 30-degree hill, no problem. What we discovered is that basically, it's kind of an interesting story that one of the big tricks for moving on the surface of sand is to make sure that for certain animals and robots, to make sure that you don't make a big fluid around yourself. And what I mean by that is sand has an interesting feature we call it a yield stress, that if I push below a certain force threshold, certain pressure, if you will, the material remains a solid.
Right.
But if I exceed that, it starts to flow.
Right.
And if you're moving on sand, on a sandy slope, we discovered there's sort of roughly two ways you can go. You can, as you know from walking up a dune, you can dig your foot in really deep, and the sand's harder to push, and you can make a kind of little solid under your foot.
Right.
But that's costly energetically. What we discovered is the sidewinders have a much more clever trick. They basically put more of their body down on the sand.
Surface.
And correct. And so it's a larger surface area. So it distributes. So any one point has a smaller force. The force per unit area, decreases. So you can always stay below the yielding of the material and that's what the animal does. Now, that sounds very simple. It turns out what the animal's doing, and you can really see this when you challenge them at the steepest slopes, where if you just look at that sand wrong, it flows. They're continuously, we don't understand how this works at all, continuously, presumably sensing the potential slip, the flow of the material,
right,
and reconfiguring their bodies to basically maintain it as a solid. And it's almost like magic what they do. It's incredible.
That's actually really cool. So they're actually figuring, okay, that steeper part's going to be more fluid if we put too much pressure on. We need to have more surface
Correct.
in this area, and they adapt the entire time. That's wild.
Oh yeah. If the surface is sufficiently severe for 10, 20 degrees sand, it looks like they can just sort of figure it out real quick and go whoop.
Right.
And by the way, babies come out of the wind. We had that one laid some babies. The babies come out fully capable of doing this as well. It's not something they learn, over time.
They were born that way. That's great.
They're born that way.
So from there, so you're doing all this, and you call it, what do you call it, granular media or something like that? That's what the term is.
Granular materials is the fancy term for things like sand and rubble and this kind of stuff.
Well, I'm going to start using it so I sound fancy. That's what I'm going to do at the end of the day. I say, yeah, I'm kind of like a physics guy. Anyways,
For real, 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 for real.
and we'll be right back. I want to tell you about something that's really cool. But first, let me set the stage for all you parents out there, new and old. Think about being so exhausted you can barely function. Now think about some of the chores you just want to do, especially when you're a new parent. Now how about this chore? Changing that stinky litter box. Yep, that one. Let's talk about Whisker's Little Robot and how it eliminates that chore so you don't have to think about it. My daughter recently got her litter robot, and let me tell you, she's got a smile that's a mile wide. Life's busy, especially for new families. So, Whisker Litter Robot taking over the daily litter box duty? It's a breath of fresh air, literally. Maintain your cat's litter while focusing on your growing family and learning more about Whisker Litter Robot models and starter kits today to get set up before your new baby arrives. And take an additional $50 off bundles with code FORREAL when you shop whisker.com/forreal. Again, that's an additional $50 off bundles with code FORREAL at whisker.com/forreal.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at PrepVet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
I know you've studied a bunch of things. I kind of want to stay on your direction. I know, and what's next after that? Because there's several things that I want to get into because I did my homework on you. You lucky guy. Anyways, but
Okay.
you're so lucky knowing that I know some stuff. Anyways, what's next after that?
Well, we continue to look at different organisms. And I'd say that intellectually, something that I'd always been interested in, and in particular, I really got I would say, an important part of my education is kind of the evolutionary biology of, well, just say the evolution of life, in particular the evolution of life on land. I had read a bunch of Stephen Jay Gould books when I was in high school and then into college, and I even got to take a class with him when I was at MIT. He was at Harvard, and I would take a class. I would go up there a couple times a week and listen to his lectures, and that was just a blast. The sort of macroevolution, molecular evolution questions of changes of body shape and form and function, these kind of cool questions over geologic time. And one thing that I had seen written about, which struck me interesting, is sort of this transition, if you will, of organisms vertebrates going from water to land 400 million years ago. And what I noticed is that a lot of those studies, would sort of make statements about the function of particular limb structure development, morphology, we call it. And those seemed kind of reasonably valid if the ground was rigid, like concrete,
Sure.
or hard packed. But I kind of imagined, and later confirmed by working with paleontologists, that the early environments where these, we call them fishopods, were kind of living, were very likely not paved roads. They were sandy, muddy banks. And I said, boy, we've been interested in these kind of questions about how you move on sandy, muddy banks. I wonder if any of our techniques could apply. Now, it just so happened that right when I first got to Georgia Tech, I was studying the sandfish, but I also wanted to do some field biology. And was able to connect with folks at the Georgia Sea Turtle Center, and we realized that little baby hatchling sea turtles were, one, amazing in what they have to go through,
And cute.
And we just happen to have on the coast of the barrier islands on Georgia, Jekyll Island in particular, sort of incredible loggerhead sea turtle nesting sites. So I had a student, her name was Nicole, and she basically spent 2 summers recording kinematic data of little baby turtles that she, was able to get from a nest, and then when they hatched, and then run them in the back of a Ryder truck, which had high-speed cameras and fluidized bed and all the kind of stuff we used, and discovered that even with their aquatic adapted appendages, they have flippers. If they're a male, they'll probably never see land again in their life. And if they're a female, when they make it to adulthood, they'll chug back onto land, weighing much more, than they did when they were babies. But despite that, these little animals were able to go over sand of loosely packed and closely packed and slopes, and much better than any robots at the time, and still probably today. And we said, man, how do these things do it? And so we had studied how these animals use seemingly simple, terrestrial, simple appendages, or simple for, and I'm putting simple in quotes, you can't see it because nothing in biology is simple, but, relatively limited terrestrial locomotor apparatus, flippers, to move effectively on sand. And we had discovered some interesting things. By the way, the interesting thing that little sea turtle figured out how to do was to jam its flipper into the ground to a certain depth to also maintain below the yield stress of the medium. And so those kind of questions were of interest to me. And we discovered that they too use their limbs, like the sidewinder, in a way to maintain the material as solid as they could for as much of their step as they could. And I happened to be at a meeting, a biology meeting, and ran into a guy named Rick Blobe, who was a professor at Clemson University. And I was giving a talk on the turtles, and we realized that, boy, some of the earliest locomotors on land probably had similarly limited appendages for terrestrial movement. They were good at swimming. And, maybe we could get some insight into how these systems, potential evolution of apparatus that allowed them to move effectively on land. And he said, well, we should study, because he was already studying it, we should study a little mud skipper fish, which said is, you could imagine, is kind of an existing organism that is some model of potentially what some of the earliest land locomotors were doing. And so, we got into that as well, and had a lot of fun studying how the animals did what they did. And in that study, we discovered not only was it the flippers, which they were using, but they used their tail as an effective locomotor appendage to help them. And so we developed a hypothesis that some of the earliest land locomotors could get some benefit from using a tail, which they presumably already were using to swim around in water.
We talked about this when we first talked, and I don't know if anybody that's listening, I think it's Japan. They've got older people that are having a hard time walking, and they've developed a tail that's a robotic tail that helps them have balance to be able to walk, which is probably relative to what you're talking about. And I thought it looks goofy as anything, but I'm wonder if that has some relativity to what you're talking about.
Tails are amazing things. Tails in terms of climbing animals are wonderful, and I could expound upon that in a separate discussion. But certainly in our situation, it turned out the tail was very useful on a sandy slope. The animals used it more as the slope increased.
Sure.
Buffering them against slipping and sliding.
Your walking sticks, if they have a single walking stick kind of a deal.
This is indeed, but here you're walking on a material which suddenly becomes a fluid.
Yeah.
And so you have to manage it. And if you have limited ability to manage it with your front limbs, or if you have few limbs, you can't do careful steps, which a mud skipper doesn't do particularly careful steps, to us at least, then having that tail as a kind of a robust buffering mechanism analogous, I could imagine, to, like you say, the balancing tail for a biped walking. But it's a different locomotor challenge.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's funny is first of all, I love I love the term thinking of sand as fluid. It makes all the sense in the world. But if you've never thought about it that way, you never do. But it totally makes sense. So it's funny when I was reading all your stuff, and I was thinking about there was a section that I'd found that you were talking about the evolution from the sea to the land, and I was thinking about all the different things you've studied, and I'm sure I've only seen a part of it. But I can kind of visualize, at least this is my crazy mind. So you're a fish, all of a sudden you're kind of in the land, but you're in mud. So now you have to adapt to get the mud. Then you get to maybe a drier sand that's a bit of a fluid, but a little bit more. Then you have to adapt to that. Then you got to get to hard surface. So I'm thinking evolutionary. I wonder if it was gradual that way, and then they just learned how to do that, or what? You got me thinking that I hadn't even talked to you yet.
Yeah, no. Again, and these stories are always so complicated because we have to realize that this is happening over tens and
Right.
hundreds of millions of years, right? For a gazelle or a mountain goat ascending a rocky cliff,
Vertical cliff, yeah.
yeah, is related, is a vertebrate related, and so some of that apparatus gets kind of
Adapts.
hundreds of millions of years later, adapted for various challenges. But clearly the first organisms to move on land were moving in. Again, we now call these. They were going from aquatic environments,
Right.
and we now call these pterodynamic environments. And so, in a pterodynamic environment, as opposed to a hydrodynamic or an aerodynamic environment,
Right. Aerodynamic. Cool.
yeah, that's a word we came up with to kind of
I like it.
because we realized when I first got into this biomechanics business, most folks were studying, when they were studying animals on land, were studying relatively simple environments,
Uh-huh.
flat, rigid ground. And we realized that, boy, the world is made of all sorts of stuff, including we call flowable material, grains,
Sure.
but also, material where you may not be guaranteed a footstep, a reliable foothold, including vertical surfaces, including burrowing, including moving in confined environments. That the pterodynamic world is incredibly rich, and I think, in fact, that's because of that richness. That's one of the reasons we don't see. You see plenty of devices, human-made devices, in air and water,
Right.
and plenty of devices on paved roads. We don't see as many devices climbing trees or or burrowing in soil, or moving beautifully through leaf litter or forest brush. And I think that's because the pterodynamic challenges are so enormous, we've come to realize.
Well, the variability of just the surface. Yeah, the surface, what's there, and all that stuff. So tell me about, have you studied, and this may not be related, it seems to me it is, a tadpole eventually grows in and grows some legs and becomes a frog. Is that some of the things, have you spent any time looking at that, how they're adapting?
No, but it's an amazing, again, you've got an organism that has to wiggle a little tail.
Right.
And then, months later has to, that's a developmental thing. I'm very interested in developmental biology questions as well. We haven't studied them in this context. But these are really fascinating questions. I just haven't studied them.
What about, I told you, my brain goes everywhere. So what about walking catfish? That whole deal that they had down in Florida where they were doing that. Have you studied them?
No walking catfish. Again, I wish, my goal, my dream
Time.
is that, someday somebody puts a lot of money into real careful study of how organisms do what they do in natural environments. Right now, the money has been small relative to other expenditures,
Sure.
federal funding. But if I had enough time and folks and the U.S. put in enough money, we could make some real interesting discoveries on all these crazy critters.
I got so many other things that I want to go. I'm trying to be careful from a time standpoint because I was thinking about Well, actually, what before I go there, and I may forget about this when we get there. I know you studied fire ants, and I want to talk about fire ants mainly because I live in Texas and you live in the South too, and we all know they're fascinating. And I know what you studied, a variety of things. Can you just touch upon that? Because I want to get into centipedes because you're doing some really cool stuff with that. But I want to get into like 30 things. So, but
No, well, the fire ants have been a lot of fun. We've been studying fire ants with my collaborator, friend, colleague, Mike Goodisman, who's a social insect geneticist here at Tech now for, I don't know, 15, 20 years. And he basically clued us into this system, again, which, if you walk through fields in Georgia, Texas, most of the bottom third of this country, you see these mounds, right? These kind of, 2 foot diameter mounds, but it's underneath the sand, underneath the soil, I should say, which is where, the structures really that they build really get impressive. And if you've never seen any of Walter Chinkle's, he's a professor, an entomologist, expert in fire ants, his beautiful casts,
yeah,
molten material, you should certainly check those out. But different subterranean ant species build different structures, and the fire ants build, something which looks really cool. And we did the same sort of thing: get the animals from the field, make kind of laboratory mimics of their environment. In the earliest days, we did sort of scientific grade ant farms, carefully wetted sand, glass particles, because you need a little bit of moisture for them to create the structures that stick together. And we discovered how they tunnel, right? It seems pretty mundane, but, these little animals swarm. We only studied hundreds of ants in the lab. A colony can have tens of thousands. But, you give them some soil and these animals just dig. They dig for a living and they immediately start making tunnels. And the most amusing thing we discovered early on is that the tunnels, we kind of characterized how the structure of the tunnels, these small little tunnels between ant farms. And no matter what soil we gave them, no matter if we started a wide hole in the ground or not, they always made tunnels. No matter what soil you gave them, what environment you gave them, they always made tunnels which were about a body length. They're a couple millimeters long, these animals, and no matter how many ants seemed to try to squeeze through, they would never widen their tunnels. They were always, just this. And so we puzzled over that in different contexts. And in particular, we developed some hypotheses for why this might be adaptive. Turns out we think it allows them to get deep into the ground quite quickly, which there's a premium when you just have a bunch of ants on the surface. This is a species which is fascinating in the sense that they get flooded, or where they evolved in South America, gets flooded frequently. So they have this other very cool behavior, which again, my colleague David Hu has studied in detail, that they can basically create living rafts of ants on the surface of a fluid, and then the colony can exist for weeks, maybe months, and then, once deposited on dry land, go and reform their we call it their protective shell, part of their superorganism. But they form these tunnels and networks, and it turns out that having a narrow tunnel allows an ant to climb up and down quite rapidly, because they can never really slip very far. If they slip, they can always pitch back a little bit, so it acts kind of like a control surface. But the most interesting thing I think we probably studied was how these animals, how they arrange their flow. You can imagine that if you got to get a bunch of ants through a very narrow tunnel, you can get a too many cooks in the kitchen situation quite quickly.
right.
And we discovered, actually, this is some work that a former PhD student, Nick Gravish, done, among some other folks, is that they sort of have interesting behaviors which don't require, and this is the key bit, don't require a central command and control. They can basically independently make decisions, those decisions being keep going down the tunnel, or give up and reverse direction when the traffic gets bad, or just don't participate at all. Or if they approach each other, keep their little antination, their little talking events pretty short. And some combination of those allows them to dig pretty intricate tunnels pretty quickly without any one brain saying, okay, there's no traffic director.
Perfect teammate thing. Pretty wild.
Yeah.
For real, 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 for real.
And we'll be right back.
As a pet lover, did you know your pet can benefit from the incredible healing power of stem cell therapy? Prep Therapy offers a groundbreaking solution taken right from your pet's own blood. Say goodbye to joint pain, arthritis, kidney and liver conditions, and more. They'll experience faster recovery, increased vitality, and extended quality of life without the need for surgery or harmful drugs. Put the wag back in their tail and discover Prep Therapy today at prepvet.com. Save 10% with promo code FurRealPodcast, covered by most pet insurance.
I'm going to briefly talk about, because I've got a question about this, but I know you were studying roots.
Yes.
And I want you to talk about that. Then I have a question about that, and then let's get into centipedes, because I think that centipede thing you're doing is really cool. But let's talk about plant roots first, and then I'll have my question, and then we'll go to centipedes.
Yeah, the plant roots is a nice story for me because it couples to a friendship I developed with a guy who sadly passed away a couple of years ago, a very prominent plant developmental biologist named Philip Benfey, who was at Duke University. And Philip happened to be visiting a colleague of mine at Tech. And one of the things we were doing with the fire ants as well as we were doing, I told you about those beautiful casts that
Right.
Walter Chinkle and others had done. We wanted to do those in the lab. So we had used our X-ray machines, which we'd used for our sandfish studies, and kind of turned them into homemade CT scanners where you basically take a bucket of ants, and you put the bucket on a turntable, and you have the X-ray shooting, and you rotate the bucket around 360 degrees, and you take pictures, and then via something called the radon transform, you can stitch all those images together and get a beautiful computed tomography reconstruction of a small, nest of ants. And so we thought that was pretty cool and made some systematic studies on it. And Philip happened to be visiting one day, and he said, boy, we met, he said, boy, those ant nests look a whole lot like plant roots. And no one's ever been able to do a really good job of systematically studying plant roots in soil or opaque, optically opaque substrate. What do you think? So we developed a great team of students and postdocs and basically ported what we had done with our ant nests over to plants and started growing plants into different controlled soils and did kind of systematic characterization of root, what do they call it, root morphology in a variety of species of plants and in a variety of soil conditions. And so that was sort of my entree into plants. And then I realized that the questions associated with how plant roots grow into soil were highly understudied. And from a biomechanics point of view, same sort of thing. A lot of Philip, my colleague and collaborator, had studied kind of molecular cellular mechanisms for development. But, behaviors by which plant roots do what they do to get into soil and to anchor and to look for stuff were largely unexplored. So we basically, again, rinse and repeat, beat that drum again, careful studies of plant roots and then trying to make some models. And that I could amplify on that because the rice root turned into a very interesting story. Very, very, very briefly, the rice roots, Philip and his group discovered this. They discovered that they had made a mutant plant, which had some genes knocked out, which seemed to grow faster into the soil. Well, that seems kind of cool. You want your rice plants to anchor really quickly. These happen to be a particular cultivar of rice. And then when they did, and then later we did, time-lapse imaging of that root tip. These are small roots, a couple millimeter diameter. They discovered that the mutants just went straight down like you'd expect any root to go straight down with a little bit of wiggling. And we imaged them in a transparent gel medium that Philip's group had pioneered, a Gelzan solution where you could see everything. And we discovered that the regular rice, the non-mutated rice, actually grew slower because the little root tip, instead of just going down straight, was always kind of doing a little bit of a wiggle around.
Right.
And the tip of the root traced a helical path, but what was left behind was a straight-looking root. And so you couldn't see it just after, observing after 24 hours. You had to see it going, time-lapse. And so we called that behavior circumnutation. People had seen this sort of helical wiggling of vine tips and above ground plant organs, but no one had ever seen this, as far as we knew, in a root, an organ beneath the soil. And we discovered that this circumnutation not only was beautiful to look at, but seemed to have some adaptive features. And we subsequently looked at how well it enables them to plant to anchor into soil, how well it just sort of allows the root tip to traverse a relatively complicated environment, because it's never getting stuck. It's never running into any one hard feature of the environment and kind of getting stuck. It's always sort of wiggling and able to glance off it. And so that turned out to be, that one little trick seems to be adaptive for allowing the plant to anchor in and explore relatively complex soil environments, aerodynamic environments.
So here's where my question is on that. And I want to get into centipedes because I think it's one funny for what I said to you before. I don't know if you remember. I'm going to say it again. But I was thinking about this when I was thinking about the ants and how they learn how to adapt and all that. When you look at the plants and they're learning how to adapt and they're doing that kind of that drill circular there,
Yeah.
are they, from a practical area, let's go, because you talked about fracking earlier, let's go with drilling a well,
Yeah.
or whatever. Are they taking that science and can that transfer over to an intuitive thing that learns how to do that? Are they transferring that over into practical applications now?
Well, the question is, who's they? And that's actually
Let's say the oil industry or whatever, anybody trying to dig something down, I guess.
well, that's actually, and I'm glad you said it, because the they is an interesting question. So, because it allows me to talk about my kind of more practical hat.
Right.
Going back 20 years ago, the other thing I picked up in Bob Full's lab at UC Berkeley was he was interacting and had pioneered interactions with roboticists.
Right.
In the late 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, there were a number of roboticists, not a huge number, who were saying, we got to get out of the factories. We got to get into the real world.
Right.
And boy, animals seem to do really well in the real world. What if we could learn from animals? And some military folks started funding these kind of things because, boy, if you could make robots with the capabilities of a cockroach, you could do a lot of interesting things, go a lot of interesting places. And household names like Boston Dynamics and others are kind of came out of those early discussions and interactions, and funding as importantly as anything. And so, I've sort of considered it my mission to bring this idea of robots. This is what I'm going to sort of reframe it as, what Bob and the other biologists were getting at, but the engineers I don't think quite saw it this way, is it used the robots as models. In physics, we like to make models. Let's use the robots as models of animals. So if I want to understand how a sandfish moves, well, I can make a theoretical and mathematical model. But if I don't have the pterodynamic environment models, why don't I make a robot model and wiggle parameters and change parameters, see how it goes?
Right.
And so that's what we call robophysics in my group for the last decade plus. We've been using this term to sort of say that the robots function as models of the living systems. Okay, so why is that getting to the practical question? Well, because it's not a big jump to say if I go from a robophysical model that works pretty well in the laboratory, in complex environments in the laboratory, maybe it could work pretty well in the real world. In fact, it was my colleague Philip Benfey, my plant root collaborator's insight, says, boy, your robophysical models of centipedes, I'll get back to your drilling in a minute, could actually be pretty useful as robots in the real world. And so I actually happen to have a company now which spun out of my lab called Ground Control Robotics, where we're actually trying to do this in a serious way. But in terms of so this is going to apply to all sorts of the systems we've studied. And a collaborator of mine, longtime collaborator, a guy named Elliot Hawks out at UC Santa Barbara, developed this cool technique for making kind of like a growing plant root robot. And what he does is it's basically an everting balloon or a piece of plastic where you basically roll up plastic and then push air. And I'm going with my hands. You can see videos on our website. And you blow air out, and that kind of unfurls from the tip, and the thing gets longer and longer and longer, and it could function like a real root. And it has all sorts of interesting properties. You can blow air out of the nose, and fluidize the sand, the soil. So I wouldn't say those discoveries have made it into oil and gas yet, but I think things are quite primed for such a kind of lower impact, more efficient ways to potentially get deep into soil. Not only actually for exploration, but for potentially anchoring and things like that.
I'm kind of thinking fracking too. I know they're pushing water down there now, but if there's a way to get it easier
Correct.
and maybe environmentally better too at some level too. Yeah, yeah.
Correct.
So let's talk about centipedes because for you guys listening, when we first talked, we're talking about a guy that went to those really slouch schools like MIT, UT, Berkeley, and now talk about your centipedes and the business you have now. I think it's so funny, but I think it's so awesome at the same time.
Yeah. No, it's something I never expected. So again, my mandate for myself is just study as many cool animals. Again, back to my 12-year-old self, as many cool critters as I can, and things that most people find disgusting. I don't know. I find that sort of interesting, just for basic curiosity and for the love of it. And again, we were making these robot models of different critters, and somehow I realized that centipedes, and again, we were interested in broadly terradynamically challenging environments. Sand is one thing, but bumpy ground or tight confined spaces, and somehow we realized that centipedes were highly understudied in anything more than flat ground. And even on flat ground, there have been very few published studies of how these animals move. And these animals, I'd studied snakes, awesome, they can wiggle their bodies to move around. I'd studied legged systems, cool, but I realized, man, a centipede is like this snake with legs. Obviously, it's an invertebrate, but a snake with, like, in different environments, does it use a body? Does it use limbs? What combination thereof? And as the environment gets more complicated, what does it do? And I realized that none of these questions were addressed. So we started doing our same thing, looking at animals and the centipedes in different kind of laboratory environments of what we think are, reasonable models of their natural environments, and have just hit a wonderland of cool behaviors, phenomena. And I could go on and on and on of just how amazing these animals are. The particular species we studied are largely blind, but they're just these incredible, just obviously tactile machines in quotes, where their limbs are sensing at all times, their antennae are sensing, they're able to contort and move and change their body waves of not only lateral undulation like a snake and vertical like doing the worm, but using different kind of combinations of leg stepping and folding and twisting of the body, and even peristalting like a worm their bodies depending on the environmental challenge. Now, all this stuff is extremely interesting to me biologically and beautiful. And then you say, well, who cares? And it turns out that my dear friend and collaborator on the plants, Philip Benfey, who sadly passed away. Before he passed away, he said, you should make a company commercializing some of these things, because we had discovered that our robophysical models of centipedes were quite capable even outside my laboratory. I had never had any interest in going outside the laboratory taking our robots because, I want to do careful systematic studies like good physicists should. But he said, these centipedes, these centipede robots, myriapod robots, the mobile physical models, they're quite capable. He had entrepreneurial experience and had done quite well. I said, let's start a company and let's send these robots into crop fields to look for weeds. Swarms of these things could be low cost, and they could look for weeds and hunt down weeds in kind of crop fields where you don't want to get a tractor or can't get a tractor or a big vehicle in there.
Sure.
And we got started, 3-4 years ago. And sadly, he passed away 2 years in. But it was about a year ago, the company called Ground Control Robotics. It was about a year ago that we hit on a new design. And I should say it's not bio-inspired in any way. Again, the robots came out of just trying to make basic models of the animals. And then by thinking through principles of how these animals move. One thing I will leave you with is that when these centipedes are moving on land, the better model form is less like, beautiful legged walkers like a dog, and more like swimmers, actually.
Sure.
They're the equivalent of swimmers on land. Their limbs are always slipping a little bit, and they're wiggling their body to let those limbs slip. It turns out that putting those features into a robot of a certain type make an incredibly capable robot that's able, with very limited control, to go over really complicated environments. Thank you, sir. Without having to do a whole lot of artificial intelligence or machine learning or processing, and that forms the basis of this company.
Well, I want to talk about your pesticide thing. I think to me, you went from MIT to being a pesticide guy. So talk a little bit about that, because I think it's brilliant.
Yeah, when Philip passed, we were searching for a number of his contacts in agriculture disappeared, and so we had these incredible robots, and what are you doing? Well, it just so turns out a friend of mine happened to have once consulted for some of the most well-known pest control companies, and started talking to somebody. Said, boy, in pests control, we have problems getting into crawl spaces. Attics are a bear. We fall through. What if your little robots could run around in crawl spaces and attics and even inspect to say, oh, you got termites over there, you got a rat over here, rat carcass over here, you got mama raccoon, and potentially intervene. Like, okay, I'm gonna deposit some chemical which could, take the animal out, or a rat trap or something like this. And so we started talking to some folks in pest control, started attending meetings. One of my folks, Daniel Soto, who's now was a student with me and now is an employee at the company, went to Pest World, which is the biggest pest conference in the U.S., maybe worldwide, last year, and had one of our robots. He draped it around his shoulder, Predator style, and walked around the conference. And he told me people wanted to buy it off him because it's a device which, you can give someone a joystick, which can control the robot, has a fancy camera on it, where it can see all sorts of stuff, and you can send it into reasonably complicated environments without you having to go in, and get, dig a hole to get yourself in, or find, as they say, the skinniest guy on the team to get into this nasty environment, or to, even a place which is hazardous, send those robots in and potentially do some jobs of value. And so now we're, and as a part of that, we were featured. This is my greatest accomplishment, I think, from my 12-year-old self to now. A picture of our robot was featured on the cover of the premier trade magazine in this industry called Pest Control Technology. And our Scuttle robot was on the cover in December 2025 with this idea.
I think it's so awesome to go from your education and your dreams that you're now the pest guy. It's the best thing ever.
I'm aspiring to be the pest guy. Let me put it that way.
I hope you are Mr. Pest himself. That's the best.
So if there are any folks out there who have pest needs, we are. You can look at our website, groundcontrolrobotics.com, and you can even pre-order our robots for pest control.
There you go. So that's what I want to get into now. So for everybody to find out about that, to find out about you, I don't know if you've got social media and all that kind of stuff. And by the way, whatever we're going to have, it's in the description as we're talking now. When you go ahead and let everybody know how they can find out all about this stuff.
You could go on. I'm on LinkedIn these days. I'm a late adopter of LinkedIn, but now that I'm in business, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. Go Daniel Goldman LinkedIn, or Georgia Tech, or Ground Control Robotics, and I respond to emails and inquiries. And
well, again, I'll have that in the description for you guys. Now, as I forewarned Dan, and everybody who listens to the show knows, this is that time where I tell that silly joke.
Please.
And so, but before I get into this, I always say, I know you don't want to hear me telling the joke, and the guests really don't want to tell the joke either. But if you want to be on the show and tell the joke, if you got grandkids, kids, nieces, or you just yourself want to be on, if you email me at mkyle@forrealpodcast.com, I'll gladly put you on. If you listen before, I have a variety of people that come on, a bunch of kids. It's always really fun because we all know my joke's really bad. So, Dan, for you, the joke of the day for you is, why don't robots make good pets?
Why?
They're just not very cuddly. That's it. That's the joke. I told you. Anyways,
Well, you are you have hit upon something actually, and I bet you in 10 years you won't be able to make that joke.
oh, I know. Well, trust me. What you hear now, it's pretty crazy, actually.
Yeah.
It's a good thing and a bad thing. But anyways, I know you're busy. I just want to tell you, you've been really patient. We had, like mentioned when we started, we had a lot of problems with the internet, but really for taking the time to be on the show and all that. But I really, really appreciate being on. It's been really fun for me. I loved it. Thanks so much.
I appreciate it. And again, I love animals and I love critters and I love it when people love those things. So
Then, lastly, for everybody else that's listening, thanks so much for following and doing all that stuff. Lastly, also be kind to animals, but most importantly, thank you so much for listening. For real.
That concludes this episode of For Real with your host, Mark Kyle. For previous and future episodes of For Real, listen via all major podcast streaming sites.